you so much, Jonathan. First off, hi. Thank you for bearing with us immediately after lunch. I know that things will be settling. You might be feeling a little relaxed for the excellent meal. So hopefully we will entertain enough to, at the same time as inform, to keep you up. And I want to echo what the opening speaker said about diversity in the room. We do have a lot of diversity in the classroom, in the auditorium today. But I also wanted to make another note, just to note that diversity also goes beyond bodies and seats. That's an important piece. It's a hugely important hurdle. But at the same time, I just want to take a survey, and this isn't to shame anyone or anything, but if you've asked a question of a speaker, raise your hand. All right, take a look around the room. OK, cool. Put your hands down. Awesome. OK, so there's a lot of diverse voices and a lot of diverse perspectives in this room. And I think that this format, having a conversation, will sort of push things forward and hopefully engage some more perspectives and some more voices. Really looking forward to that. So when we thought about what we wanted to talk about today, I asked Nathan, well, OK, we're speaking at this thing. What do we want to talk about? And the title is all Nathan. Nathan said, I want to talk about all those things that people shout about on the internet, about we don't have privacy anymore, or we're beyond the point where we can think about ethics. And for me, I contributed the sort of end of theory arguments that we have enough data, it'll tell us everything we need. And so that was kind of our starting point. And it's like, OK, let's push back on these perspectives a little bit. And one of the perspectives that we encounter is this kind of game over sort of thing, that it's a Pandora's box sort of thing. It's been opened. These things are out there. These tools are out there. Data's being collected. We're giving off data. Like, you hear these metaphors like data exhaust and data trails, right? Like we're giving it off like smoke. It's just following behind us. And given this seemingly insurmountable environment of the proliferation of technology and of data-intensive services and sites, there's this attitude that we're kind of that the game is over. The cat's out of the bag. And Nathan and I, in the work that we do and the people that we work with, and many of you have been our students. So if you've been our students, apologize. Some of this you will have been introduced to. We adopt the attitude that that's not the case. It is very much game on when we're talking about ethics and privacy and issues like justice. Saying privacy is dead is not the same thing as saying privacy doesn't matter. It's not the same thing, and it also depends on a very specific kind of definition of privacy, right? And so one of the things that we like to talk about then is how we can expand the conversation and how we can look at the ways in which ethics are already being engaged in practice. And so, Nathan, I want you to talk a little bit first about how you see this game over attitude sort of at play when you're working with people who have to try to tackle these hard or difficult problems.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's awesome the mic's working. Technology's awesome. I think one of the really fun things about privacy is it's actually really fascinating if you think about it from a research perspective. You're dealing with questions of social norms. You're dealing with questions about latent concerns. You're dealing with a lot of hard questions. But the word privacy has become so politicized that it's probably the best way to get a bunch of VCs out of a room rather than shouting fire. You can just shout privacy, and then everyone will disappear, and they'll be checking over their shoulder for the next 3 weeks. So I think it's unfortunate that it's kind of come to that point. And so I think there's this kind of privacy exhaustion that kind of the result of it from a lot of technical perspective is, well, privacy is dead. We can't control it. It's just we don't want this problem to be in the way of what we're doing. And then there's also kind of a carry-on argument that I'll borrow from you, is that there's this need for a transparency. We want a utopian, transparent kind of future. And part of the issue with this is that transparency doesn't really work. If everything's transparent, you can't see anything. And so then you get to this question of, well, who can see what? But then also this question of privacy being dead is not really the right question, because people have been making choices all the time with regards to privacy. And these manifest themselves in lots of different ways. And you see it even in data collection. You even see it in data quality. It's actually hard to be in a case where you can't see privacy as an issue. So one of my favorite things to do is to tell people, walk into Target. Target's been the subject of a big privacy breach, right? All your personal information that was in credit card, that was one type of privacy issue. If you walk into private, you're also on surveillance cameras, right? These surveillance cameras have laws associated and norms associated with how long that they can actually be kept and policies, so there's that. There's also sort of subpoena requirements for these, that you can walk into Target, you can get these things subpoenaed. That's how you can find bad guys who buy mobile phones. There's also, if you walk into the electronics section, suddenly you're confronted with a whole bunch of IoT devices. You have Nest devices, you have iPhones, you have all these really amazing technologies that have all these implications for the future. And everyone in this room has a huge say in how these things are going to play out. So to me, it's very exciting.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I like the way that I've heard you in conversation put this, that you get this, and this is why I have the image up. You've said that sometimes people come to you with some of these problems are too hard.
Yeah.
But I think that attitude is really pinned on a misconception that these practices are static, right? That these problems are static problems, and that that for some reason or another we don't participate in their maintenance or their inaction every single day. And that is something that we do. Institutions, workflows, workplaces, higher education institutions, these things don't, if we all stopped doing stuff, they would crumble, right? We enact, we produce them every single day. And so that means every single day we're making decisions that can have implications, that can have ethical implications, that can have implications for privacy, and that can have implications far beyond perhaps what the immediate goal or what the task is right in front of us. And so what I like to do is I don't like to start, when I talk about ethics in a data science context, I don't like to start from this deficit model that and I think some people do this, and I'll take the blame for any of my fellow ethicists or people that have this attitude, but that come in and point the fingers and say, well, you don't have ethics, you need ethics. And we know ethics is important. DJ Patil, chief data scientist with the government, he recently tweeted out about how he thinks all data science programs should have a mandatory ethics course or mandatory ethics training, right? So we know that ethics is important, and we shouldn't start from this deficit model. What we should start from, though, is saying that the choices that you're making, even ones that seem purely pragmatic, may already have ethical import. You're already doing the work of ethics. And what we want to encourage, and I think what we would talk about, is sort of making our students, making practitioners more aware of the choices they're already engaged in, the practices they're already engaged in that have ethical implications. And so I want, Nathan, I want to hear from you, since you engage practitioners more immediately than I do. How do you see ethics playing out in the decisions they're already making? How do you see power relations? How do you see questions of privacy? What are some examples you have of this playing out in already existing situations?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, one of the examples that we go a lot over in class is a question of just notice and consent. Who has the power in a notice-consent relationship, and what does that actually mean? And it becomes really, really tricky, because the sort of benevolent model of notice consent is you're informing someone of something you want them to know about with regards to personal information. But at the end of the day, you kind of hold all the power in that relationship, because your ability to allow them access to that information or access to that service is completely controlled by this notion of them consenting to the notice you're giving them. And so I think that's one dynamic that plays itself out a lot in lots of different examples that we see.
Yeah, right on. For me, one thing that I like to talk about is the building on that and expanding on that. We make decisions every day about what counts as data, about what gets to be data. And there's this sort of end of theory idea that with enough data, patterns will emerge, we'll get answers, it'll tell us what questions to ask. But that starts even admitting that something is data, saying that this kind of information counts, and then not collecting other kinds of information. Of the near infinite possible range of things that can be collected, those are decisions that are informed by our impressions and our theories about how the world works, our theories about what is important. Then when we're doing that, in the process of doing that, we assign labels, we assign categories, things that have political histories. And we can look to examples like Molly Jackman earlier from Facebook brought up the lack of certain of identifying LGBT people in the census. Well, the census is a prime example of an information collection document that has been fraught with politics about the kinds of categories that we use and how those categories have changed over time. And so making those decisions, we kind of think of them as pragmatic decisions we make before we get in and do the work that we want to do. But these are the kinds of things that have social and ethical import. And when we're making those decisions, we're implicitly making decisions about what gets seen and what doesn't, who's included and who's not. And so what do you see, Nathan, as like some of the perspectives or populations that might be negatively impacted by these exclusions, possible exclusions, or vice versa by inclusion in sort of large data sets?
Yeah, that's a really good point. A lot of the time this comes down to the question of harm, who's harmed by privacy. And in some cases, it's really easy to see the harm. So for example, recently a Comcast case settled where Comcast was releasing privately listed phone numbers on the web publicly. And everyone can pretty much agree that that's a bad thing. There are some other things that were happening, these being picked up, and so the question is, well, why is that a bad thing? Shouldn't, when you call someone, they know your number anyways. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of people who want their phone number private. There's law enforcement officers, there's victims of domestic abuse. There's a lot of populations, these marginalized populations, where that degree of protection matters. And I think the Comcast example is really interesting because you still want to participate in the world. You still want a phone number. You want to just not get rid of your phone number, but you want some measure of protection while you're still participating in the world. But then, you move forward and look at different sort of notions of harm that get a little bit muddier. So some of the students in one semester did a study on whale hunting. Whale hunting is not like getting in a boat and hunting whales because that's illegal. What this whale hunting is basically referring to whales from the Vegas variety. So a whale would basically be well, you guys are data scientists. It's an individual who's disproportionately responsible for the income of the organization. So, for example, one person who's a high roller would be a whale, and obviously these individuals are very highly targeted. But then what they found out is there was organizations and mechanisms that were dedicated to finding whales and changing their experience of online gaming and changing the world that they interacted with in order to get more money from them. So then you're kind of in this weird moral ground where, what does that really mean? Are these people really in control of their addictive behavior or not? And then when we get to one of the favorite hacks of today's and sort of interesting things when it comes to privacy breaches is Ashley Madison. People who don't really traditionally engender a lot of sympathy. But it's fascinating. And I know you've talked a lot about this as well and have some really great perspectives on why this is such an interesting problem and demonstration of some of the privacy harms we see today.
Yeah, so what's interesting on Ashley Madison, right, is like in some of these past examples, like we think about the Target breach, and some of these breaches that have had primarily financial impact. For one, the public, the people impacted, weren't really the ones who bore the brunt of the consequences for that, right? You have credit card companies and you have financial institutions that there are mechanisms in place that they had to pay out, they had to protect their customers in certain ways, and so as target customers, you were kind of insulated from that in certain ways. I said there was also the P.F. Chang's data breach, and I once joked that I think the worst thing that could come from that is that somebody has inconclusive data that I ate at a P.F. Chang's, and so like that was the kind of reputation reputational harm I might have. But building on that, is, I'm sorry, if you love P.F. Chang's, it's a lovely establishment. But building on that, though, what we see with Ashley Madison, and we're seeing more events like this, we're seeing the interesting convergence of certain kinds of what I would call like moral crusades or moral vigilantism online, intersecting with these conventional sort of things we understand around data breaches. And in the case of Ashley Madison, once that genie's out of the bottle, once you've been identified as somebody in that data set, for whatever reason you were in that data set, lots of journalists were very upset that that data set was leaked, right? Because they were in there for very different reasons than the average customer was presumed to be there. There were people that had lots of different motivations for using that site. But if you were identified as somebody in that site, how do you get remediation for that harm? When your financial information is stolen, somebody spends a bunch of money, you have a dollar amount that you can get back, and you can say, mostly, you might have been inconvenienced for a period of time, but that's a kind of a fair remediation of the harm. But when it's something that affects not only your life, but your family's lives, we saw in some cases in Ashley Madison it led to possible suicides, how do you sort of bring that back? Like, how do we remediate those harms? And I think that's definitely a question that we're confronting today, and that we're going to need to continue to confront in the future. Building on this and building on this idea of sort of exclusions and inclusions in data, I want to shift and build on something, again, that Molly Jackman was talking about in Facebook's role of potentially counting LGBT populations. I don't know if any of you are fans of the show Orange is the New Black, if you're fans of Laverne Cox. Like, she's a goddess, and for good reason. But she was recently speaking at the Social Good Summit, and she was talking about kind of exactly this thing that Molly was talking about, in terms of what are we saying to certain populations. It could be LGBT and queer populations, and it could be other kinds of populations, whether it's disability or ethnic or racial populations. What are we saying when we're not counting them? And as somebody who studies this stuff, and somebody who deals with this stuff, it's always interesting when one of your faves talks about it, because you're always like, yay, but ooh, there's more to the story than that, right? You're always partly into it and partly but we need to slow down. And what I thought was really interesting about this talk was yes, we need better data collection and we need better information on certain populations, but at the same time, for certain populations, that increased visibility translates to increased violence. And so the things that you might be doing as a data scientist are not removed from this broader social context. And so next week, for example, is the Transgender Day of Remembrance. And 2015 has been a boon year for transgender visibility. And part of that is the information and the data that has become increasingly available about this population. It's also been a record year for trans murders. And I don't think that these things are absolutely independent of each other. And so thinking about the ethics of the work that you do in this broader social context is very challenging. And so how do we think about that? What kind of metaphors or analogies might be available to us for thinking about what we're doing when we're confronted with these troubles? And given the I'm sure many of you are excited for the new Star Wars movie, right? And so I'm sure there are many Star Wars fans in this room. I totally am baiting the crowd by using this metaphor. And first of all, before I go into it, I'll make sure Laverne Cox does not count as one of the people I'm going to be talking about. This is my caveat. She's a goddess. This is very important. But if we go back to the tragedy of the episode 1 through 3 of Star Wars, tragedy in two levels, right? They weren't particularly good movies, but also the whole arc is a tragedy, right? And sorry, spoiler alert if you haven't watched. But I don't know. Is there anyone?
The bad guys win.
That's how it works. But there's a twist. There's a way that you could think about Anakin Skywalker, and I want to use this for a second. We know Anakin Skywalker, he eventually becomes Darth Vader. But Anakin Skywalker was kind of the ultimate, to use some Silicon Valley parlance, kind of the ultimate disruptor. He was very, very fed up with inefficiencies in government. If you remember this from the first three, he was very tired of inefficiencies in government and wanted to do something about it. So he did something about it. He dissolved the Senate and killed all the Jedi, but he made a decision, right? And he was tired of old sort of existing social structures that didn't allow him to be with the woman he loved and to exist in certain kinds of social relationships. And he wanted to do something about that. And there's this, he really thought he was doing good. And that's the really interesting thing about Darth Vader and about the character in a fictional sense. But that's a really good lesson, I feel like, in terms of sort of failing to look beyond the sort of immediate benefits that you're hoping to achieve, to think about this larger social context. And I know you have some thoughts on this matter as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I keep trying to teach my 7-year-old that with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes.
And he just knows the great power part. He still hasn't figured out the responsibility part. But I think there is a tendency that when you can build things fast and you can build things relatively good and you can get an audience of excited people want to do this, that you can build solutions really, really quickly. And one of the things that I think is difficult in this space is sort of saying, no, we want to build things slower. We want to put speed bumps. We want to sort of understand a little bit more some of the implications. And there's a fantastic book, well, fantastic depending on your point of view. It's infuriating for some and a Bible for others, called To Save Everything, Click Here. And it talks about sort of using technological solutionism as a way of solving everything. And how it doesn't really fit when you're looking at specific domains. So that you should really be looking at problems within the domain and understand a lot of the knowledge in there before you try to fix things. And I think that's something that we could really benefit from as technologists, is really thinking more about the impact of these solutions. And it's really hard to sort of say that, because I know what everyone's thinking right now. They're like, well, you don't know what the solutions are going to be. You have to try it. And I'm thinking the same thing myself. But I think it's really important to come, and that's why the ethical perspective really matters, because ethics brings a really long, fantastic history of thinking about hard problems that you can use that didn't come from a blog post 15 minutes ago. It actually has a foundation and a thought process that you can bear on these more difficult problems, which would just make technology better in the long run.
Awesome. And so I think that brings us to the end. We talked for a while, so I don't know how much time there will be for questions. But thank you so much for listening to us and our conversation today. Oh, and if you're a student, if you're a student, take our class, W231, if you're one of the mid students and you haven't taken it yet. We can talk about these things weekly.
So we've got about 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go to you two first. You've got a group of 100 thoughtful perspectives on data science here. Mm-hmm. What question would you ask them? What would you want them to think about at the moment?
I guess for me, it's like, what is the future that you want to live in? And how do you want to build it?
So, my perspective, and it was interesting earlier, I keep going back to the Facebook talk, but I think it touched on a number of really interesting things in talking about ethics oversight. And I don't know if many of you know a lot about the inner workings of institutional review boards, but there's a really interesting sort of piece of how those boards function is that they're kind of charged with thinking about the ethics of a particular study from the perspective of a possible subject. And what researchers have found, Laura Stark has written an excellent book on this, and what they found is that a lot of times these institutional review board members will appeal to people that they can think of in their lives. So like, what if my grandmother was in this study? Or if my cousin read this, he would totally, he would not understand what that meant at all. And this has had a really profound impact on the trajectory of research at certain institutions, because IRB boards might be more or less diverse. They might have a particular kind of composition that lends to more perspectives, or that lends to fewer perspectives, and it's led to these really different trajectories. And so, they call this seeing like a subject. And I would ask then, what kinds of ways do you think about when you're designing things, or you're implementing a new tool, or you're designing a study, or you're gathering data? How do you see like your subjects? and what are the resources at your disposal to sort of see in the fullest way possible.
Thank you. So a couple of prompts there. What's the future you want to create? How do you see your subjects? Anyone want to either respond to either of those or something else that Nathan or Anna said? You think, okay, I've got a perspective I'd like to bring into this. Okay, so Ron, let's go here first, and then I saw a hand up there as well.
Sure. When you Nathan, when you said what kind of future do you want to live in, I immediately went to Cory Doctorow's books on Little Brother and that sort of thing. And the thing that came to mind about that was the schism between private corporation data gathering and government data gathering, and what that might look like, and the weird divided way we have it looking at that. And I'd kind of like to hear your perspective on that.
That's a controversial one.
You expected something different?
Yeah.
I was really looking for Star Wars questions, honestly. But yeah, that's a real tough one. So I really like what Nate Silver said, in that there's only so much truth in the data set, and that sometimes, especially when you're worried a lot about gathering a lot of data, you're very prone to overfitting, which is one of the problems that he said is one of the biggest ones that you can run into. And I think as a discipline, one of the things that we're really sort of struggling with is where is that signal that we're trying to get at. And government and private industry have overlap in that space, but they have different missions. And I think the mission's actually really important. In working with people in the government space, the mission is really, and some people may not believe this, but it really is trying to help the public. There's a huge sense of service in the government, and sense of trying to really help people. And I think the private industry has some of that, but private industry is capitalism. It's about money. You're trying to get as much money as you can because your shareholders are people too. And I think one of the challenges is trying to balance this notion of service with the larger service, data gathering, and capitalism with the larger issues of marginalized populations. Because one of the things that's really, I think, scary in this sense is when you can vote with dollars, or you can vote, if you're this much higher than somebody else and test significantly in your histogram, then, in comparison, then you win. And then everybody goes that way. And so I think the people who are left to the side, they need to be part of this conversation too. And being more inclusive of that is something that matters for both the public and the private side, both from considering protections for these as well as inclusion.
Yeah,
Did that answer your question?
I was just curious what your response was.
Yeah.
I could have gotten
a
lot shorter. Darn
and
it.
I would build on that too. Also, that I think some of these differences in motivations and incentives are important to keep in mind when thinking about how you would approach a problem in a particular space. But at the same time, I think that there is this sort of hangover of this artificial kind of distinction between public institutions and private institutions. And one way in which they are both important, and I think that this division breaks down, is that both players in both spaces can be incredibly influential when it comes to people's life outcomes. And if that's something that we're interested in furthering and improving, ultimately, then sort of creating these divides and crawling behind well, we're not a government agency, we don't need to do this, or vice versa, those outs kind of become less tenable because they are both absolutely integral to people's well-being today.
Yeah, let's take. We heard from you this morning, I think. So let's go next door there.
Hi, I know your class is awesome. So I want to respond to your question about what kind of tools people can use to put themselves in the position of their clients or subjects. So I've worked at financial organizations my whole life, and they're really paranoid about being pulled in front of regulators and having read really stupid emails that you wrote in front of Congress or whatever, right? So they, in almost every orientation I've ever been in, they say, imagine that what you're going to write is going to be published in the New York Times. I try to do the same thing for like data science projects. Like imagine you're going to have to talk about it in front of Congress, or imagine that you're going to have to, or that somebody in the New York Times is going to find out about it and write about it, and like how bad could it get? And
Yeah.
I think tends to help align your interests, your personal, save your own ass interests with the with your clients.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It also presumes that stupid things don't get written in the New York Times.
Yeah.
But sorry, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But no, that's absolutely, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, please. Yeah. By all means.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. This was really, really great. I'm interested in the idea of slowing down because you mentioned DJ Patil and his work, and I was able to hear him speak a couple weeks ago. He talked about the 3 things they prioritize when thinking about projects is a huge amount of economic benefit, it affects more than half the population, or it helps a group that's consistently underserved by current standards. And so I'm torn because I'm thinking about, yes, you have to be careful, you have to protect people. At the same time, I'm thinking about like high-need schools I've worked in and other places where there's a huge opportunity to correct injustices that already exist. How do you balance? I don't get how you balance those.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I did.
You
Nodding.
did.
Thanks. Yeah, I think one of the things that comes up a lot in my line of work that I think dovetails nicely with your question is sort of the inherent risks of solving new problems is much greater than trying to attack something that exists already. And I think there's not enough attention I'd like to see in people really trying to deal with these existing problems within the frameworks of which they exist today, and trying to make those work better. Not everything has to be a disruption. Some things are hard for a reason.
And I would also say that another sort of important thing to consider is when you're balancing these considerations, and a lot of times that you just want to take the skills that you have and take the resources at your disposal and put them in motion and make a difference, right? But there are times when that kind of almost unilateral movement then can have these consequences down the road. And so I wouldn't discourage that from happening, but thinking very carefully about the voices that are at the table, not after the fact, not like, okay, we've done this thing. Now tell us, how it's helped you, or tell us how it's what impact it's had. But what voices are at the table early on, and that can stem some of these tensions, I think, in certain ways. Probably a wholly insufficient answer because it's an incredibly challenging tension and an incredibly good question.
All right, everyone, we're out of time on this one. Nathan, Anna, thank you so much for